And thanks to those of you who arrived here on time. My name is Joe McVeigh. I'm the president of the Ilsley Public Library Board of Trustees. And
yeah, I had it on and it didn't work, and then it didn't happen.
Today, we're eager to share with you some of the work that's been done by the Ilsley 100 project team in thinking about the future of our library. And we'll get started in that for just a minute. Just a couple of quick technical notes. I think most of us are fairly familiar with Zoom after having endured many meetings during the pandemic. But for any of you who are less familiar, two notes. One is that if you have the option of either seeing the person who's mainly speaking or seeing everyone else who's on the Zoom call, and if you go to the upper right-hand corner of your screen, if you're on a computer, desktop, or laptop, you have the option to change the view. So speaker view is the one where you get to see the people talking, the person talking, and gallery view is the one where you get to see everyone else. The other thing I wanted to mention is that we'll be showing some slides in a little while. And again, you have the option of making those slides bigger so they pretty much fill your whole screen, or smaller so that you can see the people talking. You can just grab the little bar, the little line in between, and move it back and forth. We're delighted that so many of you are with us today. It makes it a little bit difficult to carry on a conversation, with 20 people at a time. So we're going to encourage you to make use of the chat feature of Zoom, and depending on whether you're on a tablet or a phone or a computer, that can be a little bit different. But for those of you on a computer, in the very bottom of the screen, if you move your mouse, there's a little thing. It looks like a cartoon balloon that says chat, and if you click on that, you should be able to enter chat, and we should all be able to see what you have to say. Over the course of the meeting, we'll be sharing with you a few different options that we're considering for the future of the library. And as we get to the end, we'll ask if we have forgotten anything about possible pros and cons. If something occurs to you while we're sharing those, feel free just to type those into the chat, and we'd be glad to see what you have to say. So let me see if I could share some slides with you, and I will invite Mr. Jim Gish to kick things off for us. So feel free, Jim, whenever you can see those slides.
Yep, got them right in front of me, Joe. Well, folks, let's get underway then. Thank you for joining us. I see several familiar names, attendees today, so thanks for taking time out of your day to join us. The Ilsley 100 project team has been up and running for about a year now. And you may recall that this was a committee that was formed at the direction of the select board to look into the future of the library. So let's look at what we want to accomplish today. If we can go back one slide, there we are. So we've been looking at two things, basically. One was were the deficiencies of the building, which as you likely know, is approaching its 100th anniversary in 2024. So much like the downtown construction project that I managed, where the Main Street and Merchants Row bridges, constructed in 1921, had reached the end of their 100-year useful life, the building has some drawbacks as it hits 100 years old. So job number one was to look at the kind of the infrastructure of the building, its facilities, and look at what needed to be done there. Job number two was to look beyond that and kind of have a wider field of vision, and to poll the community on what Middlebury's library needs to be here in the second decade of the 21st century, third decade of the 21st century and beyond. So that's kind of the aspirational part of what we've been up to. So today, what we'd like to do is kind of do a quick recap, and I'll turn it over in a couple of minutes to our wonderful library director, Dana Hart, to talk about some of these deficiencies of the building, a boiler, an elevator. You may be familiar with some of the issues we've been looking at here, but also to look at the aspirational part of it and what the community has been telling us that they need to see, that would like to see in a library, such a fundamental part of our community. Then, as Joe mentioned, we're going to look at 4 building options that the team has identified. And we'll review those options. We'll look at some pros and cons. And I think we'll answer your question here as we get into the cost estimate side of things. And Joe will give an explanation of kind of what order of magnitude costing involves and kind of give you a sense of where we are right now. It's fine. Send your questions whenever you want. We're here to answer them. Then, you know, the real point of this meeting, once we've shared our info with you, is what do you think? You know, this is a great opportunity for the continuing community input and feedback. And then we'll talk about next steps on our road to the future library. So let me give you a quick rundown here of what these options are. Joe will and the team will be going over this in considerably more detail, but let's just start with kind of the view from 30,000 feet. The team has identified 4, let's call them building options. Let's start with option A here, renovate the current building. And this is really kind of a fix what's broken approach to things. The boiler needs to be replaced. The elevator needs to be replaced. New carpeting, paint on the wall. There are a lot of fixes that have gone undone in recent years, and the building's now reached kind of a critical stage where those things need to be taken care of. So that's a fix what's broken. It's also kind of a treading water approach, because it doesn't provide for any ability to meet the needs of the community as we move forward here over the next decades. That's option A. I'm going to jump down to option C next. More space is key to being able to deliver things like more community meeting rooms, more space for youth services, more quiet reading rooms for adults who want to come in and read, all the things that we're being asked for. Option A is not going to deliver any more space. Option C could deliver more space. So the committee has heard from many people in the community about Ben Franklin being empty. I think it's been empty for at least 5 years now. And wouldn't that be an opportunity to add an annex to the library? It's 3 doors down Main Street. It's for sale. It's been an eyesore, unsold in the community for quite some time now. So is Ben Frank's or some other annex an option? So those are options A and C. Let's move over to option B now, which is renovate and expand. And this is, let's stay in the same area here. We're right on Main Street, but let's reimagine how our footprint perhaps expanded a little bit, because there is some more town-owned land around the library, could meet the needs of the community going forward with the library. So this might involve, for example, reconstructing some aspects of the building, but reimagining how we could get additional space and still maintain that footprint in that great location on Main Street. That's option B. Now let's go down and complete our review here with option D, build new. Okay, you start over from scratch. You can kind of get everything that you want in a library if you're going from ground zero and building it back up, right? So this one is focused, not surprisingly, on what for years has been called the EDI site, which is Economic Development Initiative site. Many of you folks will be familiar with that. It was land that was given by the college to the town, and it sits down in the lower municipal lot along the river, sort of between Cross Street Bridge and Haymaker. And so we took this, although there are other places where a new library could be built, this seemed to be the kind of the obvious place that a new one could be built in that lower parking lot. All kinds of complicating concerns that come along with that, parking, et cetera. And we'll get into that a little bit too. So that's option D. So again, those are your 4 options, and we'll go over those in detail and get your input on them as we move forward in this meeting. Let's take a quick look back at the timeline here. 1924, there's our beautiful building taken on a snow-covered day, probably much like today. The original building was completed. I find it interesting that it took 50 some years before any additional construction took place. So that was in 1977. There's an addition that basically was to house the side entrance and the elevator. So a relatively small addition in 77. 11 years later in 1988, we have the addition on the left. This is the high ceilinged kind of reference room, reading room, which houses the stacks behind it, and the community meeting room down underneath there. That's 1988, and then inevitably in 2007, the library trustees are contemplating the need for additional space. As these things often happen, years unfold, and finally, in 2017, we get to an actual design concept and feasibility study with, I think, about a $10 million price tag. That proposal arrived in tandem with the closing or taking down of the Merchants Row and Main Street bridges, replaced them with the temporary bridges, and here we go, 5 or 6 years of construction downtown. I think the feeling at that point was, let's put this the library on hold for right now, and let's get through the downtown construction project to see where we come out on the other side. And then of course the pandemic kind of held things up too. So that brings us to 2023 and where we are today. Just a quick shout out to the Ilsley 100 project team, of which I'm a proud member here, and a reminder that who's on that team. Joe is the president, and Amy is the long-serving member of the board of trustees. Great to have them on the team here. Dan Brown and Fahad Khan, many of you know them, are on the Middlebury Select Board, both business owners or former business owners downtown. Ken Perrine, I think most of you will know, is the former president of the National Bank of Middlebury, lifetime Middlebury citizen, and someone who's been involved in many projects downtown. Barbara Doyle Wilch is the former librarian at the Middlebury College Library and a really valued professional librarian on our team here. Ruth Hardy, great to have our state senator on the team. Judith Harris and Beth Dow are liaisons to the town administration, and Kathleen Ramsey. They're critical people on our team. And then, of course, as I mentioned before, our wonderful library director, Dana Hart, who I'm going to tee up now and hand the next section of the presentation over to her. Dana, take it away.
Thanks, Jim. Hi, everyone. So as Jim alluded to, there's really two things that are driving this need for facilities, for addressing the library's facilities. And the first is that we need more space in order to continue to serve the community with the resources and services that people are requesting. We need additional space, and we need those spaces to be more flexible. But the other thing that's really fueling this is that our current library building has a long list of deficiencies, and some of them are pretty pressing. So I'm not going to dwell too much on the current challenges we have, because today's meeting is really about looking forward. But I did just want to touch briefly on a few of them, so everyone kind of has an appreciation. Oh, someone's saying that I'm not loud enough. Let me try and, can you guys hear me now? Drop a comment if I'm still not loud enough.
I think you're loud enough, and perhaps you just need to raise the volume on your computer.
Oh, okay, I see Ann says better, so that's great. Okay, so a few of the big facilities issues that are kind of lending urgency to this project are our heating system. Of course, it's on its last legs and it's very unreliable. It is not at all uncommon to come in and have it not turn on in the morning, so we place expensive service calls and things like that pretty regularly. The elevator is also approaching the end of its useful life cycle, and that unfortunately results in periodic entrapments, which we do not want. We have structural issues. Groundwater leaks into the basement occasionally. We have ceiling leaks when it rains or there's heavy snow. Moving on to the next slide. Thank you, Joe. We don't have an HVAC system, unfortunately. So that means unless we open a window, which we can't do in the winter, we have no fresh air in the building. beyond that, just not feeling great, I think we all came to appreciate during the pandemic what a huge concern that is from a public health perspective. As I mentioned, we simply don't have enough space. There are safety and accessibility issues throughout the building, especially concerning sightlines and especially concerning the public restrooms. So we'd like to address that. And then our third floor, which is occupied by Middlebury Community Television, lacks a secondary egress. So these are all significant and kind of urgent issues that need to be addressed one way or another, just for us to stay in this building and keep the building safe and occupiable. But of course, we don't want that to be the benchmark that we're shooting for. We want to have a building that does more than just meet that base level requirement for safety. So the library trustees came up with a vision statement to guide this project. And we would like a library that is a welcoming, accessible, and safe community hub with the flexibility and sustainability to enrich community members' lives now and into the future. Sadly, our current building doesn't meet that vision statement, but that's what we're working towards with this project. So one of the first things the Ilsley 100 project team did is they worked with library staff and a professional consultant to kind of think about, well, how do we translate that vision statement into a building? What kind of spaces would allow us to achieve that vision statement? And this work was really built on years of engagement with the community, focus groups, surveys, community conversations. So this slide is really just reflecting back what we have heard from you over the years are some of the community's highest priorities for this library project. So moving on. The project team came up with a preliminary plan for a building, which includes a number of new spaces and expanded spaces. New spaces we would like to add are a conference room and a community living room so that we can have more community gatherings and meetings and opportunities to get together. We'd like to add a library activity room. This would allow us to really grow and expand our programming, especially programming for kids that requires cooking or crafts or anything kind of messy that requires cleanup. We don't have a great space to support that right now. We'd love to have a dedicated teen room. We don't have that right now. It's something Middlebury desperately needs. And of course, we want to have adequate facilities in our building, which we don't have now. We'd like to expand several spaces. Under this plan, youth spaces would essentially double, so we would significantly expand the pre-K and kindergarten area. We'd be able to separate the elementary and middle school areas, which is important because those are really developmentally distinct age groups, and right now they're kind of squished together in a space that's too small. We'd be able to enlarge and enhance our community meeting room, and we would have adequate staff and storage spaces. And I just want to point out that the pictures in these slides are taken from public libraries around the country that were recently renovated or expanded. They're not necessarily what we're thinking of doing here. They're just inspirational to kind of get us thinking what might be possible. So we shared this preliminary plan in much greater detail at a series of public meetings back in November, and a lot of you attended those, so thank you. And it was an opportunity for the project team to get more feedback from the community and sort of get a sense of, are we on the right track with this? We got a ton of wonderful feedback, which did largely affirm that yes, this is what the community wants to see in a new library building. And we also got some really new and exciting ideas that we'll be able to hopefully incorporate into the plans further down the road once we start working with the design team. So in order to achieve all of this vision, in order to get all the new and expanded spaces that I just touched on, we need about 24,000 square feet. And that's about 6,000 square feet more than we have now. So the second thing the project team has been working on over the past year is identifying these 4 different options and sort of evaluating their pros and cons and their cost estimates. And that's really what we're here to talk about today. So I am going to turn it back over to Joe to talk in more detail about those options.
Thank you, Dana. So just as a reminder, the 4 options that we're looking at here are, first of all, renovate the current building. Option C would be to renovate and add an annex. Option B would be to renovate and expand on the current site. And option D, to build new. And we're going to go into each one of these options in some detail, and we're curious to know what you think about that. So one of the things that we wanted to do, Dana and Jim alluded earlier to the efforts we've made to look into these options and to consider the pros and cons and best practices in library design and so on. But we also know that one of the key factors that we're going to have to deal with has to do with how much these are ultimately going to cost. And so we were very fortunate to get to help us Henry Erickson of Erickson Consulting, who's really one of the foremost construction estimators in the state of Vermont. And we gave Henry a sort of broad picture of what these particular options might look like. And Henry came back to us with what we call order of magnitude estimates. And I'm going to ask him to explain that to you in just a minute. Henry, do you want to tell us a little bit about order of magnitude estimates and the process that you went through?
Sure. So an order of magnitude estimate is an estimate of a project it's not even on a conceptual level. It hasn't been fully developed, but getting a certain amount of information, the square footage, the program, some layouts that show where things are happening, will then and do that for all 4 options with the same kind of methodology. You get a good comparison from one to the next. Now, these aren't it's not a budget or a bond vote budget or a final cost. It's really just to get comparisons between the options, and I think that pretty much describes the process that I went through.
Great, thanks, Henry. And if you all have specific questions about the estimating process, Henry will be with us to answer those. One thing is that what we asked Henry to do was to, start off by saying, if we did this and it was this many square feet and so on, how much would the materials cost to do that? And how much would the labor cost to do that? And that kind of gives us a base figure. But then on top of that base figure, there are costs associated with construction, such as the fees for the contractor and the contractor's general conditions. We also have to think about a contingency. That is, well, what if we find something that's unexpected? Let's build in something for that. And then what about inflation, which is called escalation? We add those figures to the earlier figures for labor and materials. And then we have some additional costs because we're going to have to pay a design professional team, such as an architect, a certain amount. That's usually about 10% of that cost. And then we also have to set aside the money for owner's costs, which are things for which, as the owners, we would be responsible rather than the contractor. And that's what is going to bring us to the dollar figures that we'll be sharing with you in a minute. But just as a reminder, the order of magnitude numbers that we're giving you is not a budget or a final project cost. We really can't get a truly accurate estimate of what a project is going to cost till we have a schematic design, and we're not yet there. So let's start off by taking a look at this first possible option, which is to renovate the current building. So the idea here is that we would renovate it without expanding it. We'd bring it up to code so that the elevator is in such a way that nobody gets stuck in it anymore, so that the sprinkler system is working, the electricals and so on. The moment the folks working in MCTV and with the Friends of the Library on the 3rd floor have only one way out in case of emergency, we're not up to code there. Obviously, there's no ventilation in the library, which was brought home to us during the pandemic. We'd rearrange some of the rooms, some of the offices, some of the study spaces. There'd be some new paint, new flooring, and the pandemic again brought home for us the importance of being able to hold some things outside. So the idea was to maybe build a little structure pavilion in between that bit of grass from the back parking lot that you can see between the library and the Marquee Theater and the Ben Franklin there. So this, according to our calculations, would cost about $5.5 million. So this would preserve our beloved 1924 building. It'd be relatively easy to do this, relatively straightforward, not too complicated, and it would save us some space in case we wanted to add on to it in the future. The problem is this does not solve the need that we have for additional space for the library to be functioning the way we really think it should be. Doesn't really solve the safety and accessibility challenges, such as getting up the front steps or getting in the side door. The way that the current structure is set up, it limits flexibility for the future. And this is one of the things that we're really thinking about, because nobody really knows what a library is going to look like 20 or 30 years down the road. And also, we would need to move somewhere while this was happening. And Marilyn has a question. What about the new boiler or heating problem in this option A? Yeah, Marilyn, we were looking into replacing the boiler, and in fact, we have the possibility of getting a $500,000 grant to replace the boiler with a heating and ventilation system with heat pumps. The challenge is that alone, the heat pump solution is going to cost more than $1 million. I think the figure, Dana, was maybe $1.2 million. So we would certainly need to replace the boiler and the heating with option B. Let me tell you about option C. The idea here is that we do what we just talked about in option A. That is, we renovate, we kind of fix up the problems with the current building. But people say, hey, if the issue is you don't have enough space, why build something new? Why don't you take an existing building? And the Ben Franklin building came up an awful lot in discussions. And so that is the example that we gave Henry to use for cost estimating purposes. And it turns out the Ben Franklin building has a lot of issues. It would really need to be gutted completely and then rebuilt from the inside. We'd need to add that cost to the cost of the renovation that we just discussed. And then, of course, we'd have to buy the property, and probably we don't really know what's in there, but chances are there would be some asbestos abatement required. So the cost of renovating and expanding would be about $12.7 million. And I'm going to invite our project team member, Amy Mincher, to share with you some of the pros and cons of this option.
Hi, everybody. We were really hopeful that this would solve a lot of our problems. We were happy that it would, if we went with this annex, we would preserve our building and preserve a space downtown, a building downtown that we care about as well. We would have lots of space, like almost too much space if we were to take over that building. And it's a big open space, so we could do a lot with it to make it work for us. And you know, with option A or option C, as well as option B when we get there, we're going to have to move out of the library and during construction. So this option, because we're kind of playing around with two buildings, we might be able to stay in the library building for longer instead of relocating the whole time. It might cost less for rental space. Joe, can you jump ahead to the cons? So we were really kind of disappointed when we started looking into it more, because there were so many cons to it. So that Ben Franklin building was built in 1909. So our building was built in 1924. So we would not only have to preserve and care for our 1924 building, but also take on an older structure. And maintain it. So we're talking about elevator, heating systems, all of that times 2, which is a lot. And then because the space is so big and it's separated from the library so much, there are a couple buildings in between there. I think sometimes we think about it being like right next door, but there's actually a couple spaces in between. So it's not as accessible or as close by as we really think in our minds, I think. And so that when we really looked into how we would divide that space, we figured out that either the children's programming and materials would have to go into that space, and the adults would stay in our current building, or the adult stuff would go over to the Ben Franklin building, and the children's and teens might stay, and middle ages might stay in our current building. And that just didn't seem like a very nice solution, because families like to go to the library together, and they don't want to make 2 trips. They want to be able to share their time together in the same building. So there were other negatives too. The loss of a commercial property. That building has also 2 apartments in it. So the town would end up becoming part of our renovation cost included renovating those apartments, and the town would have to become landlords, which I don't think that's a big desire on the town's part or the library's part. So yeah, and also because it's so close to Bakery Lane, that street might also have to be closed during the construction period. So let us know if you have any questions about this. I'm sure we'll talk about it at the end as well. And remember, the price tag for this was 12.5 million, I think.
12.8, I believe.
12.8.
Sorry, 12.7.
Okay,
So,
in the middle.
yeah, thanks. Thank you, Amy. And I did want to say, if you have reactions to the information that we're sharing, please feel free to enter those into the chat as we're going along. We'll have kind of more of an opportunity for that as we get to the end. But feel free to jump in anytime that you like. So our third option B, is to renovate and expand. And this would involve repairing with new add square footage. So this could involve some demolition of the 1977 and the 1988 editions. So if you are standing in front of the library on Main Street looking up this stairway, the 1977 edition is the one that's closest to the town offices. It's essentially a stairway and an elevator with a couple of rooms on the side. The 1988 edition is the one to the left, closer to the Marquee Theater and the travel agency and the nail salon there, where these stacks are located, in the community meeting room. In the recommendations of the 2017 Library Building Committee, who worked with an architect at the time, the recommendation was to bring those additions down, primarily for the lack of flexibility, and also because of some issues related to moisture getting into the original building, which are extremely challenging to address unless you can get to the original foundation. No decision has been made for sure about whether that would happen or not, but we had to give Henry Erickson something to go on to base his estimate. And so we said, well, let's assume that we did demolish those additions and then built new instead. So if we're talking about 2,400 square feet altogether, we're then not talking about a new addition of 6,000 square feet. We're talking about an addition that would bring the total number to 6,000 square feet, possibly after taking down those additions. So this would be more or less in the same location as we are, and this could be done for about $14.8 million. And I wanted to invite Jim Gish to come back and to share with us some of the pros and cons of this option.
Sure. Thanks, Joe. So, I think it's fair to say that this option has gained considerable traction with the members of the Ilsley 100 project team and in the community, folks we've been talking to as well. So let's go over why that is, what some of the pros for this option are. As with a couple of the other options, it does retain and improves the kind of the center, what I would call the centerpiece of Ilsley, which is that lovely oak paneled main lobby. To me, that really is the heart and soul of the library. And so that stays in place. We're getting that additional 6,000 feet. As Joe said, how we get that additional 6,000 square feet is still to be decided as we move forward into a schematic design, but the community would benefit from new and expanded spaces. We talked about the new public meeting rooms, 3 of those for different sized get-togethers, and new spaces for children, teens, tweens, a variety of community access spaces. Not to be forgotten here are MCTV and the Friends of the Library. So let's talk about them for a minute. MCTV, you may know, is up on the top floor there, the 3rd floor of the library, kind of in cramped spaces. These folks provide a vital service to the community, connecting us via the internet with the workings of our town government and our cultural organizations, our religious organizations, and so they would have an improved space in option B. The Friends of the Library, I'm sure you know, provide funding for our programming. And so having them have a space that's usable for their book sales, which is the driver for the funding, is important. If we kind of, started from scratch here to reimagine the building, the spaces could be designed with flexibility. So that's important here. I think it's a great opportunity to kind of reimagine the library, but keep it on Main Street and in its current space. Now, this last bullet, gave me pause. Having been through a 6-year construction downtown, I don't believe there's anything as like a straightforward path to completion with few complexities. But I will say this, that relative to building new, particularly down along the river, where there are other issues that would have to be addressed, then this is certainly true relative to that. So I think a lot of positives to consider as we look at option B. On the con side, well, depending on how this was reimagined, there is limited space there. Would we kind of take up all of the available town space in this one option, leaving future generations, out of room for further expansion? That's a possibility. We would need to relocate during construction if particularly if we end up taking down one or both of the additions that were built in 77 and 88. One way or another, library operations are going to have to shift somewhere else. Dana's looked into some of the options and some of the costing there, and that's something we can share with folks at a later date as we get a better sense of that. Potential to reduce space for outdoor programming. This was, the garden is outside is very valued by the community, and depending on how we push the footprint of the building around, there's a potential for reducing space for outdoor programming. But again, that's to be decided as we move toward a schematic design. So those are some of the pros and cons to consider as we look at option B. And Joe, I'll flip it back to you for option D.
Thanks. And thank you, Anne, for your questions. I'm sorry, I don't think we can answer them just before you've got to leave at 12:40, but we'll make sure that we get those answers to you. So we're looking here at option D. And I just wanted to point out to you, as you look at these lovely illustrations of what these possibilities might look like, you'll notice that they're not, they're kind of abstract, aren't they? It's not really entirely clear. And the reason for that is we find that once we show somebody a picture of something, they get very, very fixated on exactly what it looks like. And since our purpose right now is to make a very general decision, is it going to go here or is it going to go there? We didn't think it would be helpful at this point to present you with an image of exactly what it might look like, because we don't know. So don't worry too much about exactly what these particular options look like. So option D would be to build an entirely new building. We would have new construction on an alternative site. And in order to give Henry something to work from, we decided to choose a site that the town currently owns, which is the lower parking lot behind the library, known as the EDI site. It could possibly be elsewhere, but that's kind of the site that we're looking at for the cost estimate purposes. Were we to use that site, that would involve taking up space which is currently used for parking. And while there are many people who believe that there is a much higher value or use to use that space for than parking, people in Middlebury feel pretty strongly about their parking. So any spaces that we removed would have to be replaced. And about the only way we could figure to do that was to have a parking garage. And so for the purposes of this estimate, we're looking at a parking garage with 2 levels on it, with a library on top of it. And then because parking garages are extremely expensive, this would very likely involve partnering with a developer for an additional use, perhaps on top of the library, such as apartments, or maybe there'd be retail on the first level, the library on the second level, not fully thought through. But one thing that we do know is that if we were to go to an entirely new building, we would then need to figure out what to do with the old building, right? What is the adaptive reuse of the existing library building? And the cost figures don't take that into consideration. So Henry calculated that building a new library alone would be about $15.5 million. Now, that's not a whole lot more than the figure that we had to renovate and expand the library. For a brand new library where we could do whatever we wanted in that space and not be constrained in any way. But then the parking garage option was really quite expensive. And so a parking garage and the new library would bring it up to about $23 million. And just as a caveat, if we were to build on another location, it would be more than 15.5 million, because this estimate assumes that the parking garage is serving as the foundation. So we'd have to add in probably $1 million or more for the foundation, plus the costs of acquiring a new space. So let me just briefly share a few pros and cons about this option. It would give us all the space that we possibly needed. It would be very flexible space, and the library could continue to operate out of its current location while that was being built. And I think we all have to steel ourselves to the fact that if it's any option other than this, we are very likely going to have to find a new space somewhere in town where we can move in some, but probably not all, of the books and materials in our collection and our staff and our operations, and be in temporary housing, for a year, 2 years, however long it takes to build the new structure. We envisioned that the library would be built on top of a parking garage and wouldn't take up as much space as the parking garage. So there'd be quite a lot of outdoor space there that could be used. And there would be the possibility for some future growth. On the other hand, this would mean letting go of the original 1924 building. We'd have to figure out a purpose for the existing building. We'd probably need to find a partner, and that could be complicated. It could kind of draw out the timeline, and given the challenges that the present building is facing, that might not be the best way to go, or there would be some challenges there. So those are our 4 options. We've taken 2 of those options off the table completely. We've decided that the idea of simply renovating and doing nothing else doesn't meet our needs. We've decided that renovating and adding in an annex is overly complex, would require us to maintain 2 buildings, and to staff 2 buildings just doesn't make sense. So our project team has narrowed it down to these 2 options. So one is build, renovate and expand and reimagine in our current space. And the other one is build new. And I'll just quickly answer Julie's question in the chat. Is there any consideration for short-term rental off-site while this whole process is being developed? Yes, absolutely. We would actually, in other words, I see Julia's asking, would it make sense to sort of expand now in rental space before we get to this project? We could think about that. I think our big concern is we would need to find a functioning space where the library could live and operate for a couple of years, and that could be a challenge. An ideal space would be someplace like TJ Maxx. The South Burlington Library relocated to the University Mall for a few years while they were building their new one. But here's our first kind of question for you. Before we get into sort of your specific thoughts on some of those specific ideas and suggestions, is the process that we've used to research and evaluate these options clear to you? Do you have any questions about the process, about how this has been done? I know it's a little bit frustrating for everybody not to be able to talk, but since we've got 20 people, if everybody's talking at once, it's going to be a little challenging. So I think we're going to invite you, if you wouldn't mind, to enter your thoughts in the chat for the next few minutes. And then for those who can stay a little bit later, we'll invite you to unmute and share your ideas. So I can't tell if John Barstow is giving us a thumbs up or is raising his hand there.
That is a thumbs up, and people can use it to good effect.
Great, thank you, John. Natasha asks if the sale of the current building would offset any of the costs of building new. If we could sell it, yeah, if that was what the town wanted to do. The challenge is, given the existing issues with the building, would someone want to buy it in its current condition, or would we need to fix those problems, before it could be sold? The folks in Manchester, and by the way, the project team has visited a number of new renovated or expanded libraries in the state, and we'd encourage you, if you're ever in South Burlington or Shelburne or Manchester, to check their libraries out. It's amazing what can be done with new architecture. But the folks in Manchester just decided not to worry about their old library. They said, let's build new. The other one will take care of itself. They sold it a few years later for about $300,000. Thank you, Peggy, for your comment on the process. Catherine was asking, would a new parking facility be used and even generate income? I don't for sure know the answer to that question. I'm sorry we don't have any of our select board members in here, but I imagine they're thinking people would be paying for that parking.
Joe, I think there's a
All
question
right,
from Maureen that got skipped, and I can
Oh,
answer that.
I'm so sorry.
Asks, why are we talking about the 4 options when the project team has essentially already decided that 2 of them we're not going to go with? And that's a great question. And it's because we really want to be clear about the process we did go through, and a lot of work went into evaluating these, and we want to let everyone know why we no longer think they're a good option. If someone has strong feelings about either option A or C, you're welcome to share those, of course, but we figured if we didn't share those options, someone would certainly say, well, hey, why don't you think about doing the Ben Franklin building? And so we just wanted to say we have done that, and this is what it would look like, so everyone has that background information.
So Julie wants to know which options are still in play, and the answer is B and D. And by the way, we should say that a detailed outline of this in the report that we gave to the select board last week is available on the Ilsley Public Library website. If you go to the Ilsley project team section, you can go to the About section and go down to the bottom, Ilsley 100 project team. And there's all this narrative and information is included there. We will also post these slides later on. Priscilla says she would strongly prefer option D. Dana has put a link in the chat with a link to the report that we made to the select board. Well, let me ask you then, can you all think of any particular pros and cons that we have not considered, especially for building new or renovating and expanding? Are there particular things that excite you about the 2 remaining options? Do you have questions? Do you have concerns? I know that Ann Taylor had a number, and we'll be sure we download the chat and get back to her on there. Carol's wondering, if there was extra space, it could be used for a coffee shop or a place for community businesses to display merchandise. We've had a lot of creative ideas for new features that the library could have. Include coffee shop comes up from time to time. My personal favorite is, and this was back when the Shiretown Marketplace was not in operation, but I thought a creamy window would be an excellent addition to a library. Some of our younger patrons have suggested a tower for the teen room. And I think Dana's favorite is a secret passageway that was suggested by one of our younger participants. Well, I'm not seeing a lot of stuff in the chat here. So tell you what, let me just tell you a little bit about Ray saying he likes the fourth option. Let me share a little bit with you about what we anticipate the next steps will be, and then I'll just open it up for people who want to talk, and we'll take the slides down and we can share a little bit more. So we're at the phase now where we're gathering your input. We'll be choosing one of these options and making a recommendation to the select board. And the subsequent steps and the timeline depend a little bit on where the, what the recommendation is and what the select board chooses to do. We think that if we were to go with option B, which is more or less stay in the same place, that would be fairly straightforward. We would have a request for qualifications. We'd have a request for proposals. We could be working with a design team by the late summer, perhaps. If the decision is to go with option D, because that involves that larger space behind the library, we imagine that the select board would want to think more carefully about the various options of that space altogether. Julie says she likes the idea of not abandoning the current building, but understands the challenges of an old structure. Paco asks if we have pictures or a diagram showing where a new building might be located. Our original thinking, Paco, was based on a proposal that was brought to the town in the mid-2010s called the Nex Bridge project, which envisioned a building kind of snuggled up to the back bank behind the on that hill that goes down to the lower parking lot, fairly close to the bridge. Other people have suggested that building closer to the river would be more attractive. So we don't have a definite thought there. And Perry wants to know if there's been interest from the town or outside developers for D. There's been a lot of talk about it. I don't think there's been anything that's actually definitely happened. If after this discussion you think of something that you'd like to contribute, but you forgot to say it, you can always email our director, Dana Hart. Her email is dana.hart@ilsleypubliclibrary.org. She'll compile all of those emails, thoughts, and suggestions and share them with the project team. Her email is in the chat there. For more information, if you go to the library's website, www.ilsleylibrary.org, there's a red banner right across the top. If you click on that, that will take you to Jim Gish's blog, where he posts periodic updates about the work of the project team. And if you go to the blue ribbon across the middle of the option there, and then scroll down to the bottom where it says Ilsley 100 Project Team, that will take you to our main page. And if you go to Select Board Reports, Lindsay, that would be probably where you'd get the best information there. So Perry's asked what the timeline looks like. Again, it depends on which of those options, and it would ultimately depend also on figuring out the funding for this process, which would involve a bond vote for sure. And Dana, perhaps you'd like to comment on some of the other options we've been looking into for funding this project.
Sure, it's still really early days. It's really helpful that we've even just figured out what the range of cost estimates might be, but whichever option we go with, we know it's going to be a significant investment. So we're looking at some combination of municipal bonding, applying for grants, and then a robust private fundraising, a capital campaign. So somewhere between the three of those, we'll come up with the requisite amount of funding. And if we can't come up with the requisite funding, then we'll have to start value engineering and making cuts to what we really want to see. But we're a long way away from that. Right now, we're still just looking into grants and preparing for a capital campaign.
Carol, you had unmuted. Did you have a comment or a
Yeah.
question?
I do. Can you hear me? I'm not sure how to do all this. Okay. I have a really big concern about building new down by the river. And that is the place of the library in the Middlebury downtown and the possible loss of business to downtown if the library isn't the community center. Now, I'm a senior citizen, obviously, and it's the library or the post office, frankly, that bring me downtown. And when I go to those places, then I walk around and see what I might want to buy. But if I had to go down by the river and to go to the library, and then I had to either walk up the hill or to get in my car and get out of my car again to go around the town of Middlebury, I likely would not do that. So I'm concerned about that part of it. The other thing that I had thought of when you mentioned that the whatever it is, Ben Franklin is out of the picture. And that was what I meant when I made the comment about, could we use some of that space for coffee shops or town people's merchants to display merchandise? I was just thinking of a way of it not costing so much, and not having that space used for for town purposes or community purposes. So that was just my thought on that. But I don't really care whether you use Ben Franklin or you use your option that you've chosen. I think that's good. I just don't want to be down by the river.
Yeah, thank you, Carol. That point is taken. And by the way, Dana is taking careful notes here and will be sharing these thoughts with the project team. We did see an example in Manchester where they had a little more space than they needed, and so they rented it out to a couple of different groups, including their town's historical society, which is a nice partnership. You have the library and the historical society sharing space together, a little revenue, little income for the library, good synergy between those options. Does anybody else have a comment or a question you'd like to offer? Catherine, just unmute there and then we can hear from you.
I've got two comments. Can you hear me all right? One is, it's not our problem that the dreadful Ben Franklin front is empty and ugly. I'm so sad about that part of our downtown, but we don't have to solve that. Although I, for a while, felt perhaps that would be a way to go. And the other is, I hear you, Carol, about the not wanting to come up from way down below, but I would love to think there is a very creative way to use our beautiful building for something totally different, such as a fabulous restaurant downtown, if we need one, or something that's right there on Main Street and continues to be used the way the library is, and we solve all our other space and air and modernity problems by being indeed in a different location. And I guess I have a third thing. When I asked about what does the community think about public parking, I know people have been talking about parking a lot through the whole construction thing. What's the sense that we really do need a parking garage, and or do we have enough parking for now?
I would like to ask Mr. Jim Gish to address the issue of parking because it came up a lot during the downtown project, and I think he has more insight into that than many of us.
Yeah, well, I heard about it a lot. So, here's the deal. I mean, if you look at the physical spaces downtown, this is just my opinion. There's plenty of spaces around town. If you go over to Weybridge Street, there are dozens of spots there that are a 5-minute walk from downtown. That in prime time, lunchtime or whatever, it can be hard to find a space, and most people want to get right in front of where they're going to, right? So, but So to me, it's more of kind of an emotional or psychological thing about parking downtown, but that doesn't discount it. It's still, it's still a reason that people might not want to venture downtown. If the library was put down in the lower parking lot, I think we would net out this in a parking garage we're placed there. We'd probably end up with the same amount of spaces that we lost in putting the parking garage there. But at a cost of, Joe, what, $65,000 a parking space?
I think Henry might have a number for us on the approximate cost of an individual parking space in a new parking deck there. Henry? If you could unmute, we would hear you better.
There we go. I think I came up with a number of around $70,000. I didn't jot it down, but it's very expensive. There's 96 spaces. And what was the parking garage part itself? You can just do the math, but it was high.
Yeah, so I think that we had estimated for a 2-deck parking garage consisting of 96 spaces at a total cost of $7.6 million. So it was upwards of about maybe $67 a square foot. Let me go to John Barstow and then Priscilla Baker. So John.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Dana, and all the staff for doing a great job. A couple observations. I think the cost of parking garage is just prohibitive, and moving to that site is very complicated about who else is going to partner on it. The library is not going to take up the whole space. Well, shouldn't. So I'm not opposed to starting new, but I am opposed to starting new anywhere but downtown, and that's about the only place. So I think it's Ixnay. I prefer B. But what I really want to say is this process represents an opportunity to invest in one of the most important institutions in our town that has been under supported for decades. Hence, 2 kind of band-aid additions that really don't serve the function, the programming at all well. The sight lines in there allow all kinds of shenanigans to go on because it's just really not safe. And I feel it's time to make this investment in spite of other pressures, and that being creative about funding, creative meaning really doing a lot of research on how to find grant money for this important sort of institution. And I'm like a broken record, I'll just say it because I'm not against anything, but I think a town that can afford to have 4 gymnasiums can afford to have a really good library. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And I'll turn to Priscilla in just 1 minute, but I did want to note Julie's rejoinder to Jim's comment that a lot of parking is kind of a psychological or emotional issue because you can't park right in front of where you want to be. And Julie says, if you're a senior citizen, perhaps with limited mobility, that's not a emotional or psychological issue. That's a real issue. So thanks, Julie. Priscilla.
I have a number of concerns about building down by the river, but the one that's at the top of my list, and I don't hear people really talking about this. I'm assuming there have been engineering studies about the safety of building. I'm thinking about parking garages and all that concrete. And given the future of the climate crisis, I worry about any kind of construction, new construction down by the river, and the potential, if not next year, maybe in 10 years, for flooding and erosion. And maybe we've learned something from the studies in engineering that were done for the rail tunnels and the bridges project. I don't know, Jim, if you have some information there about the stability of the riverbank and how deep down we go before it's stable. So I just think it's folly for us to build anything substantial that close to a potential floodplain.
Thanks.
I'll just add, Julie, the bank was stabilized over on the rail side with a lot of riprap, those large stones. What I will say is that there's a world of permitting that would have to go through to build along that river. We'll start with the feds and the Army Corps of Engineer, and then we'll go to the state with ANR and DEC. It would be a complicated web of permits that would have to be and an expensive web of permits that would have to be worked through, I think, to build along the riverfront.
Thanks.
And Julie, point taken on the parking.
Hey, Natasha, what are your thoughts?
I was just wondering, I mean, because I have a young son and we love to go to the library. We love our library and we love other libraries as well. And it's so lovely to go into a library like the Pearson one in Shelburne, and you have this beautiful space for kids. And one, on his behalf, he wanted me to reiterate that kids want to be out of the basement and they want real light and they want nice spaces to be in. And he's seen those. And so he says, why can't we have that in Middlebury? But the other point, and this is to just emphasize what John said, I do hope that, especially for the kids of our town, that we're willing to put in the investment to make, I mean, it is a community center already, and it's used by so many people in our community. And I would really hope that we're really thinking down the road. I think either option would be a good option. But one question I had, and it does seem very attractive in some ways to start new, even though there is a beautiful building, but have you thought about possibly building, and if there's any other space downtown to build in other than right down by the river, which obviously has other concerns and issues? I was just wondering if there's any possibility of that.
Where?
Yeah, I think that hits the nail right on the head, what Joe said. At the very beginning of this process, the project team talked about location, and they did make the decision with feedback from the trustees and the select board to narrow, to really only consider downtown locations to keep the library downtown. And we just couldn't really think of another space. Yeah, if anyone here can think of a place to build new downtown, let us know.
Yeah, Perry suggests the land between Twilight Hall and the college. I don't know who owns that land, but I'm betting it's the college. Oh, John or Carol, do you know?
It's the Addison County Grammar School Corporation, of which I'm a board member.
Me too.
Yeah, Carol, right. So yeah, that's not going to happen. The other was who's mentioned, Priscilla mentioned to the College Park. Yeah, in front of Bob is there. That would be, in some ways, that would be a good location for it. But in the trade-off with the town and the college now owns that property. So that would have to be a discussion with Middlebury College. John, you're saying not so fast?
Well, I just believe they have a 99-year lease on that property.
Okay.
And it has to revert to a civic public function if it's ever built on. That is my understanding from when the transaction was done.
Okay.
I actually did a thumbs down on putting it there because I think it serves a function, and it's,
Yeah. Yeah.
There have been some voices that have said, maybe our focus on the current downtown of Middlebury is misplaced. Perhaps the current downtown of Middlebury is a little bit on the boutique-y side, and the real economic engine of the town is going to be on Route 7 South. Maybe we should be looking somewhere, for example, down near the dollar store at the old Desabray site, because that's close to the middle school. It's not too far from the high school, and so on. And we should be thinking differently in the conception. I would say that the project team has really been more interested in the downtown master plan. And as Carol pointed out, the library is a big driver of traffic, right? We bring people downtown to go to the library, and then since they're downtown, now they'll do some other shopping. So, yeah, Henry, while we have you here, could I ask you to address one question? This came up in the chat, and I think it might have been just before you joined. But early on, one of our participants who since had to leave was asking this question. She wondered whether the construction estimates are based solely on the current building codes or whether there are or will be protections against increasingly destructive weather conditions. In other words, when you're putting in your estimate, are you assuming that the weather doesn't change too much, or do you somehow try to calculate what climate change or something would do?
No, I don't think that's a necessary thing to take into account, because the current building codes take into account all sorts of different issues like that. You know, if you're in an earthquake zone, or even if you're not, you have to build to a certain standard for the building. And the current state of building is very robust. And I think there's plenty of regulations in place. And I don't think that, you know, and if there were things that changed, it's not going to increase the cost that much, you know. So I think I think the budget where it's at would cover those things.
Thanks.
And, you know, 20 years from now, I have no idea, but
yeah,
in the immediate future, yes.
Yeah. Any other thoughts, questions, comments from folks? Well, we're very grateful to you all for taking the time to come and listen to us share these ideas. The project team will be meeting next week. We expect to make a recommendation to the select board in mid-February, and depending on their response, we'll see how things move along from there. All of our agendas and meetings are and meeting minutes are published on the library website. All of our meetings are open to the public. They're often Zoomed, or you can come in person. We usually meet on the second and fourth Thursday of the month at 10 a.m. in the library's community meeting room, displacing some children's story times because we don't have enough room. But you're welcome to come to those, and I'm sure we'll post the slides from this fairly soon. And Dana, Jim, Amy, any closing comments?
Thank you everyone for your time. That's what I was going to say. Thank you so much for attending, and also the meeting on Tuesday was really well attended too, so it feels good.
And remember us when it's time for a bond vote.
Yeah.
We will.
Thank you all for
you.
coming. I really appreciate it.
Thanks.
I do bond vote budgets too.
Do you? All right, Henry, we'll keep you in
yeah.
mind. Thanks, Henry, for all of your help and all of your work.
Yeah, thanks. I really enjoyed working with all of you. It's been a pleasure.
All right.
So,
For us too.
thanks.
Thank you, Henry.
Thanks, Henry.
Okay, bye-bye.
Great. So Dana, you want to stop recording maybe?